or your phone, I want you to go to Luke chapter 10. If you're watching online, we're glad that you're watching. For the last couple weeks, we've been in this series that we're calling Investment Advice, and the idea behind it is that as followers of Jesus, there are certain things that the New Testament says we should be heavily invested in. There are certain things that if you do them over a course of time, you'll receive a return on that investment. I came across an article this week that was just released by Forbes magazine in which they identified for last year the top 50 companies in America that were most valuable, the top 50 most valuable companies. Now, one of the things that a good investor will always do before they invest their hard-earned money in a company is to do a little background work and make sure that company has a history of making money, because the more money that company makes, the more return on your investment you can expect. And I won't share the whole list with you, but the top 5 that were listed were all companies that you probably recognize. Coming in at 5th was the bank Wells Fargo. Coming in at 4th was another bank, the Bank of America. Then at number 3, there was a company known as Alphabet, which is a little misleading because that's actually the parent company of Google. Then second on the list was another bank, J.P. Morgan Chase. But number 1 on the list is one that all of us are familiar with, and that's the company Apple. They're the people that, sell computers and iPhones and iPads and all the stuff that's become such a part of our lives. In fact, in August of last year, 2018, Apple became the first publicly traded company in history to be valued at more than $1 trillion, which is just amazing when you think about it. In the article, they pointed out that if you had invested in any of these 5 companies, then over time, you've made a pretty significant return on your investment. And if you happen to get in early enough, you potentially have made a lot of money. According to the people who track these sorts of things, almost everybody that's ever invested in those 5 companies has made a return on their investment, but not everybody. I have a picture that I want to show you. Because of the cultural impact that Apple has had over the last 40 years, it's possible and maybe even likely that you recognize 2 of the 3 men in this picture. This is a picture of the 3 men who are considered to be the founders of the company that we know today as Apple. 2 of them have become cultural icons in the business and tech world. Steve Jobs, the guy with the glasses there, and then Steve Wozniak, the bigger guy in the middle with the beard. They're considered to be the founders of Apple, and there's been lots of books written about them, a couple documentaries, a couple movies about this partnership and this huge company that sprang from this partnership. But as you can see, there's a 3rd guy there, an older man on the far right. His name is Ronald Wayne. Now, back in 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who were both then in their 20s, felt compelled to bring in a 3rd partner, Ronald Wayne, who was then in his 40s, and they wanted him to serve as, quote, the adult in the company. His job was to oversee contracts, negotiate contracts, oversee production, make sure they didn't make any big mistakes, and that would free them up to focus on creating and innovation, all the things that would drive the company forward. So on April 1st, 1976, the 3 of these men signed a contract in which Ronald Wayne was given a 10% stake in the company that eventually became Apple, making him the 3rd partner. The problem was that almost as soon as he signed the contract, Mr. Wayne started to have some pretty severe second thoughts. Now, by his own admission, he was at a different point in his life than his 2 younger partners, and he was afraid, what if the company goes bankrupt? Am I going to lose my house? Am I going to lose the things that I've already built up? And as the questions began to circle around in his mind, his anxiety level continued to rise. His blood pressure went up. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He was haunted by anxiety that something was going to go terribly wrong. In fact, it became so unbearable that 12 days later, on April 13th, 1976, Ronald Wayne sold his 10% stake in Apple back to Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak for a grand total of $800. Now, fast forward to 2019, if Mr. Wayne had chosen to hold on to that 10% stake in the company, it would now be worth upwards of $95 billion. In a recent interview, Mr. Wayne made it clear, even knowing that he didn't regret his decision because, in his own words, if he had stayed in, he would be, quote, the richest man in the cemetery. I thought that was a pretty good way to put it. So I've thought about this story over the last few days, and I've concluded that Ronald Wayne is the perfect example of someone who made a wise investment but gave up too early. One of the things investment professionals will tell you is that the key to experiencing a significant return on your investment is you have to stay in it long enough to allow things to develop. If you stop too soon, if you pull out too soon, if you try to short circuit the process, you can miss out on most of the rewards. So I've been thinking about this a lot this week, and I've become convinced that this is what many of us do, especially when it comes to our spiritual lives. You know what I'm talking about. Maybe you make the decision that you're really going to invest in your prayer life. You're going to start to pray. So you do. You spend more time in prayer than normal, but a few days into it, you're not immediately experiencing the results you want. You're not getting the answers you anticipated, so you stop praying. Or maybe you make the decision that this year's going to be different and you're really going to give to the church. You're going to give of your finances to support the things that are closest to God's heart. So you do, but then a couple weeks in, the budget gets a little bit tight and the first thing to get cut is your giving. Or maybe you start a Bible reading program and you're following along and you're checking off the days on the program, and then you get a few days into it, and to be honest, you don't really feel all that different, so you just sort of stop. This morning, we're going to talk about another investment that we're called to make that I think we sometimes give up on too soon. And that's this whole idea of trying to reach your community. Now, if you have your Bible open to Luke 10, I want us to look at a story that Jesus told that I think shows us what it really means to invest in your community. But before we look at the story, I want us to first look at a conversation that took place between Jesus and a religious lawyer. Now, as Luke 10 opens, at the very beginning of the chapter, you see Jesus. He's got 72 of his closest followers, and he's sending them out on an outreach mission. Their goal is to take the message of Jesus and spread it from one central location and really have an impact on an entire region. Then you keep reading, you get down to verse 25, and you get to eavesdrop this incredible conversation that takes place between Jesus and the man in the crowd. One of the things that was true, everywhere Jesus went, there would be these huge crowds of people that would gather around him and want to listen to him teach. But in this instance, there's a man in the crowd who the Bible Luke calls him an expert in the law. That's the Bible's way of saying that this guy was a lawyer who specialized in religious law. And one of the things that was an ongoing source of tension in the life of Jesus is that the religious guys, the leaders in the temple, the leaders in that movement, never were quite sure what to make of Jesus. Even though they were brilliant thinkers, they couldn't wrap their mind around who he was and what he came to do. So you see them all the time trying to ask him questions, trying to back him into corners in which he would say something that they could later use to discredit him. And that's what's happening here. Jesus has been teaching this crowd. This guy stands up and he asks Jesus a very direct but also very dangerous question. Check out verse 25 of Luke chapter 10. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? That's really the question right there. I mean, that's the question that all of us struggle with. There's something deep inside of us that knows that what we're currently experiencing can't be all there is. We know there has to be something better out there, and there's something within us that wants to know, how do we get from what we're currently experiencing to what we were created for? What do we have to do to get from here to there? But there's more going on here than meets the eye. That's why when this guy asked the question, Jesus, rather than responding with an answer, asked a question of his own. Now, normally, I hate people that do that. You know what I mean? You ask them a question, they ask you a question, and rather than giving you an answer. But when Jesus does it, it's okay, right? So Jesus comes back with this question, and he knows that there's more to this story. There's more going on here than meets the eye. Jesus knows that this man has a different question. There's a question that's underneath the question. Check out what happens, verse 26. What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Verse 28, you have answered correctly. Jesus replied, do this, and you will live. Jesus knew this guy's an expert in the religious law. So rather than giving him an answer, he allows him to answer his own question. And you got to give the guy credit. He gets the right answer. He combines these two scriptures that every Jewish person would memorize when they're a little kid. This guy had memorized them. Jesus had memorized them. Most of the people in the crowd that day had memorized them. At the most basic level, every Jewish person in that culture, every follower of God knew that they'd been commanded by God to do two very specific things: love God and love their neighbor. In fact, it was Jesus himself who combined those two ideas. According to Jesus, and you see this in several places in the New Testament, it's by loving the people around us that we most clearly demonstrate our love for God. See, it's one thing to say that we love God. I mean, from one angle, it's almost easy to love God. You know what I mean? You go to church once in a while, you sing some songs, you pray, you put a little bit in the offering plate, and you walk away and you convince yourself that you really love God. But Jesus makes it clear that unless that love is demonstrated by the way you treat the people around you, then it's not really love at all. And let's be honest, that's the challenge for most of us. I mean, it's one thing, to love God. It's harder to love the people you work with and the people in your neighborhood and the people who get on your nerves and those family members that know how to, push your buttons, and the employees that won't do what you tell them, and that friend that just annoys you all the time, won't stop calling you. I mean, it's easy to love God. We're all pretty good at that. It's harder to love some of his children. But I want to make sure you catch what Jesus said in verse 28. He said, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." Now, here's an important reminder that you see several places in the New Testament. It's this: doing is better than knowing. Make sure you understand that. Doing is better than knowing. So I think about my own life, and maybe you can relate to this. There's a whole list of things that I know how to do, that I know I need to do, that I don't do. Or how about this? There's a whole list of things that I do a little bit of now that I know it would be good for me to do more of, but I don't do more of. For example, I work out a little bit now. And I know it'd be really good for me to work out more, but I don't work out more. And it's not that I don't know how to work out. In fact, I know a lot about working out. I know more about working out than you know about working out. And you know a lot about working out, but I still don't work out more. Why not? It's not that I don't know how. It's that I just don't. I'm too busy. I've got stuff to do, and the chair's really comfortable, and I get tired at the end of the day, and I'm spending too much time in the drive-thru at Dairy Queen, I don't have time to work out. Now, I know how, but I don't do it. When it comes to working out, I know more that I'm doing, and you probably do too. And normally, it works the same way when it comes to your spiritual life. If you went to church as a kid, or if you've been coming here for any length of time, the odds are pretty good that you already know what you need to do. You probably already know the things that you need to do to demonstrate the love of Jesus to the people around you. One preacher said it like this: most of us Christians are educated far beyond our level of obedience already. That's true. It's not that we don't know, it's that we don't do. For the guy in this story here in Luke 10, he already knew exactly what was expected of him. I mean, he knew the answer. Jesus asked the question. He had those verses, man, they rolled off the tip of his tongue. He knew exactly what he was supposed to do, but he wasn't doing it. And Jesus said that doing is better than knowing. When you get to verse 29, this guy asked a question, and it's the kind of question that I'm pretty good at asking sometimes. Check this out. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "Who's my neighbor?" And there it is. That's the question that's underneath the question. This is the kind of question you ask when you're trying to figure out what's the bare minimum that I need to do in order to get by. This is the question you're trying to limit what's expected of you. So it's the first day of school, and Jesus is the professor, and he hands out the syllabus, and he says, okay, here's what you need to do to get an A. And you see all that, and when class is over, you go up to the professor, and you say, okay, Jesus, I know what I need to do to get an A, but what if I'm just interested in passing? I mean, what if I don't want an A? I mean, I'm a busy guy, and I got a lot going on, and D equals diploma, so what do I have to do just to get a D? I just want to sort of skate by. And that's the kind of question you ask when you're trying to put a limit on what's expected of you. So Jesus does the most incredible thing. He hears this guy's question, and rather than answering him, he tells this story. Now, my suspicion is this is the kind of story, you've probably heard this dozens of times. Even people who don't read the Bible, who don't go to church, they've heard this story. But I want you to try and look at this story or listen to this story with fresh eyes. Because I think when you do that, you'll see not only is this story a great example for us to follow, it's a clear picture of how a lot of people in our culture view the church today. See, one of the investments that we've been called to make as followers of Jesus is an investment in our community. And yet, if you spent much time trying to do that, oftentimes there's this deep disconnect between what we're trying to do and what people think we're trying to do. I mean, there's this canyon, there's this unbridgeable gap between where we are and where people think we are and what we're really about and what people think we're about. And there's a lot of people in our world, and let's just be honest, who have a very skeptical view of the church and of what we're trying to do. So what do you do to bridge that gap? How do you change that perception? Well, if you look at this story, Jesus tells us, verse 30. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed on by the other side. Just to give you some context so this makes sense, the road from Jericho to Jerusalem was just over 17 miles long. And because of the elevation, it went almost straight down. In fact, over the course of 17 miles, the elevation would drop 3,600 feet. It's also a very curvy road, a lot of huge rocks, very rough terrain. So because of that, it was not at all uncommon for these gangs of robbers to hide in these curves, to hide behind these rocks. And what would happen, you'd have some traveler going down the road. These guys would jump out, they'd beat them up and take their stuff and leave them for dead. Because of that, for centuries, that little stretch of road, that 17-mile stretch, was known as the Pass of Blood. That's how dangerous it was. So as Jesus tells this story, he's describing a real-life situation. Everybody in the crowd, they knew people that had been attacked on that road. So here's this guy, he's traveling home. He gets attacked by some robbers. They take his stuff. They leave him for dead. The plot twist, though, and the thing that makes this story so compelling is that while this guy is lying there on the road after being attacked, he has at least two people who encounter him and choose to pass by on the other side of the road. Now, the first man Jesus mentions is a priest. A priest in that culture was somebody who served in the temple in Jerusalem, and they offered sacrifices to God on behalf of the people. So the way it worked is a priest would work in the temple for 4 weeks, and then they would rotate off, and they'd be off for the next 11 months until it was their time to come back. And the way Jesus tells the story, you have this priest who's been in Jerusalem at the temple, so you might think about him like he's a well-known preacher. Here's this well-known preacher, and he's on his way. He's served his month at the temple. He's on his way home, and he encounters this guy that's been beaten up and left for dead. So what's the preacher do? He crosses over to the other side of the road to avoid this guy. I mean, even though it's obvious this guy's in desperate need, the preacher's too busy, he's too tired, he's too important to be bothered helping this guy. A few minutes later, a Levite comes along. Now, a Levite was somebody who served in the temple and assisted the priest when it came to maintenance issues. The temple is a huge complex, took a lot of people to keep things moving, to make sure everything was working it was supposed to. So in one sense, a Levite is kind of like a deacon. So you got a preacher and a deacon that are on their way home from church, and they pass this guy on the side of the road, and the implication is that this deacon, he's just rotated off duty, he's on his way home, he sees this guy, and what's he do? He follows the example of the preacher, and he crosses over to the other side of the road because he doesn't want to be bothered with helping this guy. Now keep in mind, both these guys knew the commandments about loving God and loving your neighbor. I mean, they could have quoted those verses just as quick as the guy in the story. And the way I envision, I can't prove this, but the way I envision it, it's very likely to me that the priest that Jesus talks about probably just got done at the temple, preaching a series about how important it is to love God and love your neighbor. But then on the way home, when it comes time to actually do something, they cross over to the other side of the street and they do nothing. Let me stop here a minute and just tell you something you may not realize. The truth is that in the world that you and I live in today, in 2019, that's increasingly becoming most people's view of the church. They look around and they see all the issues that plague our world, all the problems that are threatening our communities, and they think to themselves, where is the church? Where are all these people that claim to follow Jesus? And from their perspective, and I'm not saying I agree with them, but they're convinced that most of us are a lot like the preacher. We're a lot like the deacon in this story that Jesus told. They're convinced that while we might be aware of the problems, we're content just to sort of cross over to the other side of the street and not get too engaged or not get too involved. George Barna runs a research organization, recently released a survey of several thousand millennials in which they were asked, how important do you think it is to be involved in a church? 30% say they think it's important. 30% said they don't think it's important at all. And there was this 40% in the middle that said it may be important, but it's certainly not really important. Now, if you're doing the math, that means 70% of the people surveyed said they don't think being involved in a church is all that important. Of those 70% of people, Barna and his team asked them the follow-up question, why is it that you don't think church is important? And here were some of the words they used to describe their view of the church. Number one, irrelevant, boring, out of date, out of touch, hypocritical, intolerant, too exclusive, too political, only interested in my money. And then this one, inward focused. Carey Nieuwhof is another researcher who recently reported that while the church globally is growing like crazy, and it is, there are two places on planet Earth where the church is not growing. Anybody know where they are? Europe and North America. In Europe, we have cathedrals that were built for thousands that are now occupied by dozens. And according to his research, 94% of the churches in North America are in decline. 94%. So what do? How you turn that around? There are a lot of different things that go into that, but it starts with changing the perception. Look at what Jesus says, verse 33. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said. And when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Now, the reason this story would have shocked people, especially the people in the crowd that day, is because in the first century, Jews and Samaritans were sworn enemies. I mean, they didn't have anything to do with each other. It's hard for us to imagine this racial tension and hatred and division that had developed, but over time they developed such hatred for each other, they wouldn't even look at each other, they wouldn't speak to each other, and they certainly wouldn't engage with one another and connect with one another. And yet in this story that Jesus tells, it's the Samaritan. It's the outcast. It's the guy who never gets invited to the party. It's the guy who's not even allowed to worship inside the temple, who shows us what we're supposed to do as followers of Jesus. So if you want to invest in your community, it takes 3 things you see modeled in the story of the Good Samaritan. Here's the first one. You learn to look for needs. The way Jesus tells this story, the Samaritan was just a normal guy doing what he normally does on a normal day when he randomly encounters somebody who's in desperate need of help. Now, I don't think this is one of those deals where this guy got up that morning and thought, you know what, I'm going to go down to the Pass of Blood today and I'm going to hang out and wait until somebody gets beat up and then I'm going to help him. It wasn't that. This guy was just out there doing his normal thing when he encountered this guy that needed some help. He was looking for an opportunity. He was looking for a need. Earlier, I mentioned how the story of the Good Samaritan is one that's familiar to almost everybody. Because of that, newspapers and news channels will often use the template of the Good Samaritan to tell these stories. They're called modern-day Good Samaritans. So I looked up some examples from this week. On Wednesday of this past week, A newspaper in St. Louis ran this headline: Good Samaritan stabbed after stopping domestic violence situation. Then in Sacramento on Thursday, there was this headline: Good Samaritan pulls driver from car fire. Then in Oklahoma City, there was this one: Good Samaritan helps reunite 6-year-old boy with mother after he walks away from school. And in the article, it told the story of a little 6-year-old boy named Xavier who raised his hand, told his teacher he needed to go to the bathroom, but when she gave him permission, rather than going down the hallway to the bathroom, he snuck out of the school out a side door, ran to the edge of the school property, climbed over a fence, and started walking down the side of a busy interstate in Oklahoma City in a torrential rainstorm. About 20 minutes later, he was discovered by a driver named Amanda Lopez as he walked down the side of Interstate 240. Now, thankfully, Miss Lopez stopped. She called the police, who were already looking for the boy back at the school. I've got a picture I want to show you. Thankfully, this all had a happy ending. They found the boy and brought him back to the school. But later that evening, a local news station interviewed Miss Lopez, and she described it as just being in the right place at the right time. But I was thinking about this some, and you got this little boy, sneaks out of school, climbs a fence, he's walking down the side of an interstate in the middle of the day. And here's my question: how many people drove past him before somebody stopped? I mean, you think busy interstate, middle of the day, 20 minutes, probably hundreds of people. And then I thought this: I wonder how many preachers drove past him. I wonder how many deacons drove past him. I wonder how many people in the span of that 20 minutes drove past this guy as he's walking down the interstate in a thunderstorm. I wonder how many people drove past him who go to a church that on the weekends talks about loving God and loving people. My suspicion is probably quite a few. Here's the deal: if you're ever going to change the perception that so many people have, it starts with learning to look for those needs. Here's the second thing: we need to learn to connect with people. Now, in that culture, Jews and Samaritans had nothing to do with each other, but for the Samaritan in this parable, he's not at all worried about the labels. He's not worried about what anybody else is going to think. All he's worried about is the person in front of him who needs help. He's not worried about the backstory. He's not worried about how they got there. He's not worried about what anybody's going to say. He's focused only on the person. That's why when you look back at this man's question in verse 29, it's a question that a lot of us have asked at a lot of different points. He asked the question of Jesus. He says, okay, Jesus, who's my neighbor? Who's my neighbor? Who is it that I'm supposed to connect with? Who is it that I'm supposed to serve? And here's the answer: it's everybody. Or another way to say it is, it's anybody. It's everybody and it's anybody. It's the people who live in your neighborhood. It's the people you work with, the parents of the kids that your kids hang out with. It's the people you see in line at the store, the people who take your order and cook your food. It's the guy who works on your car, the guy who delivers your medicine. It's the guy who mows your yard. It's the couple who's always out, and you know they are. They're in your neighborhood. You're taking a walk. They're always out in their yard, and you see them coming, and you try to avoid. I mean, that's who it is. It's the people who get on your nerves. It's your kid's teacher, their coaches, and the people you hang out with on the weekends. I mean, it's everybody and it's anybody. It's for everybody. And it's our job to connect with as many of those people as possible. That's our job. Here's the last thing. You don't just connect. You also have to invest in people. You look at this story closely. It's incredible the lengths this Samaritan goes to in order to serve this guy he doesn't even know. He stops what he's doing. He takes time out of his schedule. He uses his own clothes to make bandages for him. He uses his own money to buy these expensive oils and wine for his wounds. He puts the man on his donkey, rides him into town as he walks along beside him. You look at verse 34, it says he even spent the night with him, taking care of him. He gets up the next day, he goes to the innkeeper and says, hey, I'm going to be back in some days, and when I come back, I'll pay whatever bill he runs up. He just wants this guy to stay there as long as he needs to. And remember, he does all this for a guy that he doesn't even know. That's why when you get to verse 36, Jesus asks a question that even a lawyer and even a preacher can't get wrong. Check this out. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And look what Jesus says next. Go and do likewise. And there it is. That's the challenge. The challenge is not knowing. I mean, we all know. You knew the story before we read it. We all know what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to demonstrate the love of Jesus to the people around us. The problem is that far too often, we just don't do it. Knowing is not the issue, but as Jesus said so often, man, doing is so much better than knowing. One of the things we spend a lot of time working on as a staff is how can we as a church demonstrate the love of Jesus to the people that live in our community. To that end, several years ago, we started what we call our FCC Loves Monticello projects. And we've done dozens of these over the years. Austin mentioned to you last week, we fed some high school teachers. We're going to feed some more teachers here in coming months. We've taken donuts different places. We've cleaned up yards. We've folded clothes. We've given gift cards. We've taken money to different places. And on it goes. I mean, there's this long list of things that we do that we're going to continue to do. But the truth is that the backbone of all of this are the little things that all of us can do to help express our love for our community. So as you leave today, there's some guys in the lobby going to give you a little card, and some of you have seen these. It might be new to some of you, but they're going to hand you a card, and on it there's going to be an assignment. You just do what it tells you. It's designed to take you less than 15 minutes or cost you less than $15. If you don't have $15, we'll give you the $15. Just whatever. We just want you to express the love of Jesus to some people in our community. In your bulletin this morning, you should have found an invite card. We'd love for you to combine those two things and give the person that you're expressing that love to an invite card. But the most important thing is that we want people in our community to know that we care about them, that we love them. Now, a lot of people in our world have this idea that the church only wants something from them. And we want to do our part to convince them that we want something for them. I want you to stand. There's one more verse I want you to look at. The Apostle Paul writes this letter to 1 Thessalonians. In 1 Thessalonians, he begins a letter. He makes this statement to this church at Thessalonica. He says, and so you became a model to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia. The Lord's message rang out from you. Not only in Macedonia and Achaia, your faith in God has become known everywhere. So I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about this verse, and my dream, and I know this isn't possible, but my dream is like if Paul would just write us a letter. If Paul wrote a letter to our little church in Monticello, could he say the same thing about us? Do you think he could say, and so you became a model to all the believers in Monticello and southern Kentucky? The Lord's message rang out not from you, not only in Monticello and southern Kentucky. Your faith in God has become known everywhere. Do you think that's possible? I do. But in order for that to become a reality, it's going to take all of us doing the best we can to invest in our community, connect with the people around us, and express our love for God, not by talking about it, but by doing it. Because doing is better than knowing. Let's pray. Father, we come before you this morning, and we've tried to do some cool things, Lord. And every time that we have done what you've called us to do, you've done some even cooler things. So, Lord, we're praying that over the next couple weeks, as we try to invest in our community, as we try to love on some people, that you would honor those efforts, that your Spirit would multiply our efforts to bring people closer to you. And Lord, we're going to trust you to help us do that. In Jesus' name, amen. If you want to pray with somebody, you want to talk to somebody, David and I will be here on this front row. All you have to do is just come out and talk to us.